It's not calling you Josh Frydenberg, it's calling you Dosh Frydenberg.
Under the coalition, taxes for hard-working Australians will always be lower.
You know, I don't hold a hose, mate, and I don't sit in the control room.
They're answers that only can come from Victoria, I'm afraid, because that's not my job.
But I ain't spending any time, though, because in the meantime, every 3 months, a person is torn to pieces by a crocodile in North Queensland.
Well, g'day, listeners, and welcome once again to the Two Jacks. It's the 4th of May, 2026, and this is episode 155. And joining me, as usual, is Hong Kong Jack. G'day, mate.
G'day.
How are things in Hong Kong today?
Well, at least we've got power today. Tomorrow we'll have none at all in our building.
Well, that's a building that's isolated to your building, I presume.
It is, yes. You should be pleased about this. All 220 car spaces in the building are going to get a little EV charger each.
There you go. Important sort of stuff, I suppose, to have that infrastructure there. You know, Australia's still battling with this stuff, particularly around regional Australia. There's just not the infrastructure there at the moment, or where it is, it's often degraded, not working, and making it a little bit difficult for EV drivers.
To be fair, this is a little bit easier in a city state rather than in a big country like Australia.
Yeah, no, look, there are issues, but you know the EV take up is pretty strong. So, and it'll only get stronger with what we're looking at today, because as of course we discussed last week, we're going to have a look at the worldwide effects on the economy and food security around the Iran war. I still haven't come up with a better term for it than the Iran war. Should it be the US-Iran war, or how should we explain it, Jack? How should it be called? What's the proper nomenclature? I get stuck on Iran war, but that indicates that they're sort of at war with themselves.
I actually think that's reasonably good shorthand, and these things are meant to be shorthand. It's not just a war with the US or just a war with US and Israel. There are other players involved in this as well. The rest of the Gulf.
Yes, I mean, if you've got to list all the parties involved one way or another, you're looking at an essay rather than a short description.
Yeah, and it's also, I mean, the war between Iran and the United States has been going on since 1979, unbroken. And even that was wider than just with the United States, you know. And it was in the mid-'80s that the Iranians killed 84 people in Buenos Aires, or just outside Buenos Aires. And we had to kick out an ambassador just months ago because they were organising to bomb a synagogue. So,
well, this is something that we will discuss, because there have been a number of sort of terrorist outbreaks, particularly in Europe, Jack, and there are various proxies that link all the way back to Iran. There have been more than a dozen incidents in Europe alone, 28 arrests in the UK alone. So we'll get to that, you know, because part of the effects of this war will be the sort of ongoing terrorist potential strikes. But before we start today, there is a Redbridge poll out today. Primary vote shows One Nation down by 2 to 27, Coalition +5 to 22, Labor -1 at 31, Greens no movement at 13. Two-party preferred, if you take the Coalition as the second party, is 54-46. If it were One Nation, it's 55-45. Little bit of a boost there too for Anthony Albanese. He goes from -17 on his approval rating to just -9 with a +8 boost. Pauline Hanson's negative approval rating is just at -1. She was up by 2 points to from -3. A little bit of a tiny boost for Angus Taylor and Canavan. Larissa Waters now down 1 point. These things are fairly marginal. But overall, Jack, what it's showing us is there's not much damage being done to the Labor vote. Let's remember that the election last year was just under 33, and they're running at around about 31, 32 at the moment, depending on which poll you look at. So we really are just looking at a rupture of the vote on the right, aren't we?
And interestingly, the Nepean by-election on
we
Saturday,
got that to cover. Yeah, but go on. We might as well do it now.
but I think a fair assessment of that is that One Nation underperformed their polling.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, one thing that I did want to say about the Nepean by-election is that it's the oldest electorate in Victoria. That tends to mean it will be strong on to the right. And the coalition's vote compared to 2022, I'll just pull up the figures, mate. It didn't cop that much of a belting, really, and in two-party preferred terms, there's really no difference at all between the 2022 election and the by-election on the weekend. That tells me, obviously, there was no Labor candidate. They decided to sit this one out. So Fon got 25%, Libs 38, Indies. There was an strong independent candidate there with 21%. Greens down a little at 10. As I say, 63-37 in the 2022 election. The Libs were 48, so they lost 10 points. Labor had 38. They have actually held the seat. Labor held that seat one election prior, I think from 2018 to 2022. But unusual for that to occur. And there was no Fon candidate in the 2022 election. So it really hasn't changed terribly much at all. And 25% seems to be about as high as One Nation's vote will go, Jack, even in those areas where you might expect them to prosper.
Yeah, it's a bit of an unusual electorate in the sense that it's kind of three electorates in one. It's got a kind of a working class strip on the coast, Rosebud, etc. It's got the blue bloods of Sorrento and Portsea, and it's got an agricultural area, but a rich agricultural area down the coast. So
down sort of Wonthaggi way.
Well, and even
on
before
the
that,
way to Wonthaggi.
Red Hill, all those kind of places, right? You know, so it's an unusual electorate. But my biggest takeaway is that, as I say, One Nation underperformed its polling. So
it could just be, Jack, that we're looking at a bit of a protest vote.
Yes,
that may not be realised at all. Of course, we've got the Farrah by-election. It's this weekend, isn't it? And I'd look for some new polling, but there's not much there. It really just sort of comes down to whether voters who might have voted Liberal or indeed National, although Nats haven't sat in that seat, I haven't run a candidate in that seat for many, many years. It's whether they follow the party, their party edicts and vote accordingly.
It also just might be that some of these people who say, yes, I'll vote One Nation to the pollster, when they pick up the little stub of HB pencil, are perhaps a little bit less inclined to do so.
Yeah, I think there might be a bit in that too. Look, we'll see how Farrah goes. Certainly the independent candidate there, Michelle, is it Melthorpe, I think? She has her work cut out for her. She is said to be a Teal candidate, has the support of a number of sort of Teal people, and including a branch of the Murdoch family. She'll have her work cut out for her because the main right-wing parties, including One Nation, are preferencing one another. So I think the really interesting thing from this, from a sort of psephological point of view, is just how often people do follow their how to vote cards and whether they make their own choices. That's going to be a really interesting thing to see next weekend.
Something I struggled with, I've got to tell you.
I don't think it's as pervasive as we think. These preference allocations. I did see Angus Taylor say, it's the best of a bad choice, and then went on to sort of run down the teals again. And I'm just not sure how that works for you in the long run, Liberal Party and Angus, because you've got to get those votes back somehow or other in the cities. Otherwise, you got no hope.
In internal Labor Party elections in Victoria, they run exhaustive preferential. It's one of these ridiculously complicated things that the preference whisperers really love, right? I used to have to, there would be, I reckon, every third weekend there'd be something you'd have to spend your Sunday morning voting on. And at that stage, I was working in the same firm as the future Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, and she often scrutineered at these elections. And we'd have a coffee on Monday morning fairly often. She said, "Oh, I see you voted yesterday." And I said, "I thought it was supposed to be confidential." She said, "Nobody else would have quite your combination of preferences in one of these things. Most of them do what they're told and follow the thingo, but I can always find yours."
Yeah, there you go. You're an outlier, Jack. But yeah, it'd just be really interesting to see, I don't know, how slavish people are to the HDVs, or whether they make their own minds up. I suspect there's a fair bit of the latter going on. We did promise our listeners this week that we'd be looking at the effects of the Iran war on global economic output. We know that the Strait of Hormuz has been closed really since the last day of February. It's triggered the largest energy supply disruption in history, causing severe global economic strain and an imminent food supply crisis. And we've sort of broken these things down, Jack. What we're doing now in the Northern Hemisphere, at least, is we're getting into cropping time, into planting time, particularly for major staples like rice and wheat, Jack. And a lot of that will be impacted by the lack of fertilizer commonly available into places like Southeast Asia and Southern Asia. Let me start with a question about this, Jack. Compared to what was going on in the Ukraine initially, at least when the Russians invaded Ukraine, there was a blockade essentially of Ukrainian wheat and phosphates to the world that ultimately, either by negotiation or both, by negotiation and by the Ukrainians basically scuttling the Russian Black Sea fleet, that grain, those fertilizers, those other things that Ukraine is one of the great food bowls of the world, didn't have those impacts that we're talking about, Jack. What's the difference between that scenario in the Ukraine and what's going on now in the Strait of Hormuz?
Well, the Ukraine thing was had a more immediate impact, or was going to, because it was food on ships ready to go, whereas this blockade isn't stopping food. What it's stopping is fuel and fertilizer, which is gives you a longer lead time before it has an effect, if you like. Right?
A lot of container ships as well there, Jack, being held up.
But they're not carrying life-saving equipment or life-saving food. It's just not quite the same thing. There's all sorts of little bits and pieces that they're doing, but this has a longer term effect rather than the short term effect of there's just no wheat to make flour with, right?
Yeah. So let's have a look at where we are on the spot price today for Brent crude oil, which is kind of the globally accepted price. It's $113.40 per barrel. That's about as high as it gets, Jack, or it has got since the Iranian conflict began. This is causing all sorts of pressures for countries around the world. Many governments have given up on or at least cut back their fuel excises and their various means of taxing fuel. What's the situation in Hong Kong there, Jack, with Is there been any not interference? Has there been any work done by the government there to ensure that prices stay pretty low?
Yeah, they're subsidising fuel for taxi drivers and for commercial operators.
Right.
So rather than subsidise everybody's fuel, what they've looked at is say what's going to have an immediate deleterious effect on people and the economy. Well, it's really the cost of transporting people and goods around, right? So we can head off a taxi fare increase, and we can prevent a rapid increase in the cost of goods by reducing the cost of transporting people and goods.
All right. Yes, Australia has taken probably a bigger step than any other country. I did look at this comparatively, Jack. Most countries have eased off their excise. Many countries don't have an excise in place. The Taiwanese, for example, they will continue to allow the refineries to absorb price without putting the price up at the bowser. That's a somewhat different system. Our fuel excise reductions, they've been extended now. They're about as big as anywhere in the world. And when we look at the polling today, do you think, I just was driving past a servo a few moments ago. Price per litre now is about $1.70 in Australia. That's for unleaded petrol. Diesel, I didn't grab, but we know that we're getting supplies from North America and South America. How would you say how the government has handled the immediate problem with the supply of oils, Jack?
Not too bad. I mean, all things considered, they probably get a pass on it, right?
I think they'd probably do it probably a little bit better than that, Jack. They've been able to keep the price down, and we know in the States that trigger of that $4 per gallon is still considerably less than Australian prices. But there's no attempt by the US government to rein in price increases, and while there was a period there in March where our petrol prices leapt into the sort of $2.20, $2.30, $2.40 per litre. Now they've sort of eased back. It means there's going to be a shortfall on the budget, which we'll get to. But I think overall, so far, the government deserves a little bit of credit in regard to this. They've absorbed a significant loss. They had to do something, of course. If the price increases, they're going to continue to get more and more excise. So that would have just been politically disastrous not to do anything. But overall, I think thus far, it seems to have been pretty effective. Okay, well, this is from our good mate and regular listener, Lawrence, who's a farmer. He says, luckily for the world, there has been a couple of years with no production issues, so there is quite large stocks on hand. This is in regard to fertilizer, this is actually in regard to food, which had led to depressed prices. So far, the war has not caused much of an uptick. Of more concern to the market is a dry period in the US grains belt. That's a really interesting sort of angle, because there are some particularly critical weather issues in the US at the moment, which will affect their grains output. And then Lawrence goes on to say, on fertilizer, it was interesting that the Indian government put out a tender for 2 million tonnes of urea and received offers totaling 5 million tonnes, which suggests there is a product available but at an elevated price. It's more or less doubled for nitrogen, and phosphorus is up around 40 to 50%. So first world economies are unlikely to see a major impact on production, but developing countries won't be so lucky. That's Lawrence's view, and he buys fertilizer and we don't, Jack.
Yeah, but that marries in with what I've found out is that it's a price issue rather than availability issue at the moment.
Yes. So that's where we are at the moment. Of course, we can't say what's going to happen, Jack. The latest.
We can, but we might not be right.
Well, we can't predict the future. No one really can, but we don't know how long this conflict is going to last, is what I'm saying. And the latest announcement is that the US Navy is going to escort shipping through the Strait. I don't know how that works. I mean, well, we were told, weren't we, that the Iranian Navy is now to be referred to in the past tense. But that would appear not to be the case, Jack. They still have little boats going around and causing trouble with shipping.
Yes, well, you don't really need capital ships to do some of this damage these days. You can use a speedboat.
You use speedboats, you can use drones, all that sort of stuff. But the fact is that the Iranian Navy still exists in significant enough number, with significant enough craft to cause problems around the Strait of Hormuz. So we'll see how the escorting. I mean, you are dealing with perhaps automated powerboats loaded with explosives, those sorts of things. How they go up against cruisers and battleships, Jack, US battleships. I don't really know. What we do know, and what we talked about, just referred to really earlier, is that by this means, the Ukrainians were essentially able to render the Russian Black Sea Fleet, sunk its main battleship, of course, the Moskva, and a number of others have gone to the depths, and it seems to be. I mean, if you think about the Strait of Hormuz, they're basically going through that around about 10 knots, so they're pretty much sitting ducks, aren't they?
It is a little bit more complicated than that. The Strait of Hormuz these days, it's basically closed to oil shipping. I mean, Iranian shipping as well. I mean, the blockade seems, so far as I can find out, it seems to be holding. That no one's getting ships through.
Yeah, and so would you think this US naval blockade, this US naval escort will change things at all?
I'm not even sure it'll happen. To be quite honest,
it starts today, Jack. Come on, Donald says it starts today. So I mean, part of the problem we have, if we're just talking about this analysis, is that we're not getting a lot of. We didn't expect to get a lot of truth out of the Iranian regime, but we're not getting much truth out of the US regime as well. What countries are really in the gun in terms of supply, Jack? Particularly in our own region, excluding Iran, excluding US for the time being.
It's the countries who would struggle to pay the high price for urea, etc. It's Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia to a lesser extent, Philippines, of course.
Yeah, we've talked about the Mekong Delta in previous episodes. So we're looking at northern hemisphere's, I guess, spring crops going in around this time, right now, actually. And so there may be some significant problems around the Mekong Delta, also in India, Jack. I do notice the United Nations World Food Programme warns that if the closure persists through until June of this year, an additional 45 million people could face acute food security. Where did they come with? How did they come up with that figure, Jack?
No idea.
But there obviously there's some sort of mathematical equation that says, we produce food at X. With the Strait of Hormuz closed, it's now crop yields are expected to be Y, and in the and therefore people living in pretty parlous situation at the best of times are likely to sort of go into some form of hunger or famine. what would be the most critically exposed countries, Jack? We've mentioned Vietnam, Thailand to a degree, Africa as well, Sri Lanka we've mentioned on many times in this program, and Brazil, I think, is considered to be one of the great food sources of the world. They're in a bit of trouble too, aren't they?
It's not always easy to predict, I think, how these things are going to pan out, because part of it is what's the management like, what's the governance like in the individual countries. That can make a big difference. I mean, Sri Lanka, that was pilot error. That was a self-inflicted wound, and some countries will do that again, and some won't. Some will manage it better and go okay.
Yeah. Well, look, we've mentioned Vietnam, so let's have a closer look at it. Gas prices in Hanoi surged on the back of the outbreak of the Iran war. There was panic buying. Jet fuel prices have tripled. Higher oil prices up 30% year to date are triggering inflation and threatening to curb GDP growth, with the Vietnamese dong facing pressure. Now, that's which I'm not trying to make light of this, Jack, but you always should go long on the dong. That's what I've always been told. Agriculture and logistics, fertilizer shortages and high diesel costs are impacting farmers, while sea freight costs have increased 25 to 35%, causing logistical bottlenecks. There's diesel shortages in industry, delaying construction projects. So it sounds very, very serious in Vietnam. And as I said, the Mekong Delta is one of the food bowls, certainly of the region, but more broadly into the United States and the Philippines.
Yeah, it really depends on how long this goes on for. For places like Vietnam and Thailand, they can wear
one bad crop.
Yeah, they can wear some short-term problems. If it's were to go. If we were still talking about this in 18 months' time, it would be a real problem. But in the short term, not quite so bad.
Well, let's look at Thailand, Jack, and of course, not so much Vietnam, but Thailand is one of the major refinery centres in the region. That's where we're getting some of our petrol, through Thailand, through Brunei, through Singapore. Whenever you fly into Changi, Jack, you go across this vast expanse, Changi Airport, you go across this vast expanse of petrol refineries in Singapore. And you can certainly understand why the oil companies prefer to do it that way, rather than having little refineries all over the place, including in Australia. But agricultural, there is a sort of problem there with Thai rice, Jack. Skyrocketing fuel and fertilizer costs. It doesn't mean famine. It just means everything's going to be far more expensive. And those people, even just with one crop, even those people who are in particularly vulnerable positions economically, they are the ones that'll be hit hardest, aren't they?
Yeah.
The way it always works, I suppose. There's nothing particularly stunning about that. The conflict has disrupted, this is for Thailand again, exports to the Middle East, such as to Iraq. So it's not just what's coming in, it's what's going out. Yeah. Thailand's heavy reliance on imported oil for electricity, around 32% from the Gulf, increases the risk of high energy costs being passed to household and businesses. Tourism and finance, the conflict risks reducing tourist confidence, and the Thai baht has experienced instability. That's another thing, Jack. Global tourism and global travel is going to be impacted, and is probably now. I think a lot of people will be putting off their travel, holidays, etc.
Well, even if they don't want to, the airlines, I think nearly every airline that I checked has reduced its flight schedules on account of fuel availability and price.
Yeah, so you're paying an absolute premium to have that summer or spring trip to the UK or to Europe.
If you can get there.
Yeah, if you can get there.
Yeah.
I suspect it won't affect the cost of travel at all, because it's still a fuel availability thing. But Qantas is now flying direct Sydney to London, Sydney to Paris, I think, too, as well.
Yes.
Obviously, that means you don't have to stop in the Emirates. And I think that's problematic too. That would keep a lot of people away. Just the idea of going travelling to the Emirates, even though I imagine you'd be quite safe, but it is right in the firing line. So, what can we afford to see? What are we likely to see in the region, Jack, over the next 3 months?
That's more of the same, I would say. But people, people in the markets and people in governments in the region will be watching what happens in Iran very closely and hoping it's over relatively soon.
Yeah, we can get to the sort of cause of war. Perhaps we should have a bit of a chat about that. But let's have a look at what's going on in Iran first, Jack. And they are, economically, they look like shot wood ducks. Cost of living has soared, with the annual inflation rate reaching 67% in a month through mid-April from the same period a year earlier. The subsidised price of red meat, which was mostly imported through sea routes, has gone up to the equivalent around $3.60 a pound, beyond the reach of most in a country with the minimum wages around US dollars $130 a month. Living is not affordable anymore, said Marty Godsey of the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies. Iran is at its weakest point. Iranian state media estimates that post-war reconstruction would cost around $270 billion, a crippling sum for a country with an annual gross domestic product last year of $341 billion. Gee, that's underperforming, isn't it, Jack, for a country the size of Iran's? That's almost 80% of Iran's annual GDP. The US gross domestic product is about $31 trillion. So for us, I'm not sure who's saying this, it would be like facing a post-war reconstruction cost of $24.5 trillion. So that's all the cost of reconstruction, which is going to be pretty difficult. Iran International says Iranian state media estimates that post-war reconstruction would cost around $270 billion. I'm just looking for. There's been a prolonged internet shutdown. I read a piece in Iran, as we know. I read a piece that a number of people within the regime are accessing Elon Musk's Starlink, Jack, to get around the internet shutdown, but that's one thing. Meanwhile, you've got a lot of the Emirates who have just basically almost ceased production of oil. So even if today there were two signatures on a piece of paper in Islamabad, peace in our time, all that sort of stuff, you're going to find that these problems are continuing for months afterwards, aren't they?
Well, they're going to take some time to fix. When you cap an oil well, you don't. Our friend Grant could probably tell us, but you don't just turn the tap back on. Right?
Yeah, it's not quite as easy as that. But look, with this particular food crisis in Iran, Jack, does that increase the likelihood of regime change internally? People on the streets, etc. Hungry people are angry people, etc.
Well, I think it does. The difference, say, between the situation in Iran and what happened in, say, Sri Lanka, for instance, is that the regime in Iran, at least part of it, is run by people who have an apocalyptic view of the world. That is, they would be quite happy to see their whole region burn to the ground, provided their regime survived. Now, that's not all of Iran, and it's not all of the regime, I don't think, but at least part of it are as nuts as that.
Yeah, that's true. But if you're an Iranian citizen, Jack, and you're not particularly disposed towards the regime itself, how are you viewing this? I mean, will people rise up if they get hungry enough? If they're out of money, if they can't use a banking system, if they're being locked in their houses at night and these sorts of things. I mean, how long do you think that will go? Have we got the sort of preconditions for regime change, economic preconditions, and I guess militaristic preconditions for regime change in Iran? I'm not seeing that at all. And it's very hard to know, but yeah, go on, sorry.
It's hard to know because we don't get any information out of there. There are bits and pieces of information that suggest that on a small scale that is happening, that there have been individual attacks on IGRC people and bases, etc. But how reliable that information is very hard to check. Eventually, people will get hungry enough and angry enough and will do something. But when that happens, who knows?
It's also fair to say that the Iranian people have had to deal with so much economic repression, social and cultural repression, that the people themselves become inured to the pain they have to suffer.
Yeah, up to a point.
Up to a point. But they are I mean, if you ran around in Australia and said, look, everything's going to be 5 times the price of what it was, including petrol, I mean, there probably would be people on the streets. But the Iranian people, because they've had to deal with this repressive regime for as long as they have, they probably just sigh and just let it move on.
Yeah, they won't keep doing that, I don't think. I mean, the numbers are kind of staggering. At the start of the revolution, a US dollar was worth 70 reals. Now it's worth $1.25 million reals. That's so. If you had some wealth 57 years ago, it's worthless.
Yeah, but we're not seeing because
and Iran was a relatively well-to-do country in those days.
What, under the Shah, the CIA appointed Shah, Jack.
But there were plenty of people who were doing.
They did have a democratically elected government, Jack, and then they got knocked off again by the Shah and the CIA. Perhaps a little bit too, if you meddle too much, this is what happens. You get the worst possible example of a government, ultimately, if you keep screwing around with the will of the people. Let's move on to Australia now, Jack. We've got a budget coming tomorrow week, actually. Obviously, the Australian government has lost a fair bit of money in terms of petrol excise. There are other issues that will continue to cause debt, but it would seem that we're caught a little bit betwixt and between because there need to be significant budget savings, Jack, and it's probably not the right time for that to be happening.
No, but there are going to have to be, I would think.
Yeah. So one of the things, I did see Albo doing a walk and talk with the ABC around Lake Burley Griffiths last night. He was quite chipper, but he was trying to ease the pain that might come when they're almost certainly going to announce changes to the capital gains tax in regard to housing investment. They're almost certainly going to do something with not capital gains. What am I saying? The
negative gearing.
Yeah, negative gearing. I'm sorry, thank you, and those sorts of things that they promised at the hand on heart at the start of the election, during the election campaign last year, that they wouldn't do. Are they going to pay a price for that?
Oh, we probably always pay a bit of a price for it. But look, if you've got to do it, you've got to do it. The answer is you've got to be open about why you need to do it. And people will accept a fair bit if you go there and say, this is what we need to do, this is what we're going to do.
Well, what about the contention, Jack, that this is basically a nod to the demographics running in Australian politics at the moment, where those people, 18 to 45, are now well and truly in the majority of the electorate, Many of them feel disenfranchised with government. They feel that they can't buy a house in the city they grew up in. They notice previous generations have got tons of assets and money, and they don't. So is this really a nod to, this sort of haves and have-nots based on age?
I'm sure some of it is. I mean,
that means it's good. It must be. Look, we don't know what the design's going to be, but really they have to market this as saying, well, we've got one generation. Most of them don't vote for us, and then we've got another generation here. This great block of people, Millennials, Gen Z, etc., who are sort of more or less sticking with us, but they are still suffering the same frustrations that they have been for many years.
Really, the road out of this problem is economic growth. And I don't think either party is serious about that. Either of the big parties, or One Nation, or the Greens, none of them are serious about that.
Well, it's a really big thing, Jack. We talked about housing policy, but of course it hasn't been terribly effective. There was supposed to be, there's a $10 billion housing future fund available, Jack, but hardly any housing going in. We do see state governments taking over some of the planning and local government, taking over a good deal of it. But then when it comes to something like selling the Rosehill racetrack, Jack, to open up a bit of land for development in the Sydney area, it gets knocked on the head by NIMBYs.
Knocked on the head by the racing industry as well, I think, before
and elements within. But yeah, is it good politics? Because you're playing to, I think it's Cosamaris reminded us, that 18 to 40 block, I think it was, now outnumbers the 41s to the grave. And these people have, unlike generations previous, they have not moved from left to right as they've gotten older, got into mortgages and so forth, and that's probably the big reason that many of them can't afford to take on housing in the major cities. So it would be pretty good politics, except to say it's divisive, because you'll have one group of people, a significant demographic, who are going to be furious about this.
Anybody who takes on the task of trying to grow the Australian economy is going to annoy a lot of people, right? You think back to the early 90s. You go back even further in Australian history. Australian history's had a long periods where governments have just drifted along and done not much, right?
The whole economic system was based on that, Jack.
And we've done that.
The 80s.
We've done that since about the end of the Keating government, midway through the Keating government. There hasn't been a prime minister or a government since then who's really taken on the task of growing the economy. None of them, in my view. And
not even Howard's GST, Jack?
Well, I think that was my assessment. I think Howard was a pretty good prime minister, but he just kind of consolidated what had happened during the Hawke-Keating changes. Right, is my honest assessment of that. But he was pretty good at that. Right?
A lot of middle class welfare introduced at that time that obviously needs to be rolled back, and to be looked at exactly. Yeah, so whenever you give people something and then you take it away, it's not the people who gave it to you in the first place that become the target of all the anger. It's the ones who have to deal with it. I'm talking. Go on, sorry.
If you go back to the when this happened, though, the start of the Hawke period, Hawke and Keating, his treasurer, knew that what they were looking to do to grow the economy, because the economy was very much like it is now, just drifting along. Right? If they wanted to do that, they had to make some major changes, and that meant they were going to have to annoy a lot of people to get that through. So you really needed someone with the courage and the flexibility and the preparedness to go out there and sell what they were doing to the Australian people that Hawke and Keating had. And I look around now, and I'd love to see someone like that now, but I'm not sure that I can.
Well, we probably won't have another Keating in our lifetimes, and maybe never again. And of course Hawke too. I mean, Keating's great gift was to be able to explain economics and government economic policy in a way that was comprehensible to the vast majority of people. That is a skill set that very few people have in politics and outside it.
Yeah, perhaps because he left school at 15. So someone had to explain it to him first. That might have been a good reason for it. The other thing was Hawke was authentic. Hawke could go out there and talk to people and they knew what he was talking about. But that's what really there needs to be some fundamental changes, and I don't see this government doing. Jim Chalmers is talking about something called the fourth economy. It's going to be based upon making Australia a renewable energy superpower. And as soon as you start drilling down into what that means, it just all disappears in a puff of smoke.
Yeah, there is that sense about it that it is, if it's built on decarbonisation of the economy or of industry, etc., digitisation and human capital, those things tend to be a little airy-fairy. What we are looking at, Jack, and look, I've seen some alarmist stuff coming through, that we are looking at an inflation rate that will, so the March figures are just going to be coming out very soon, Jack, and they're likely to have added about 1.5% to the inflation rate in Australia.
Yep.
And there's further forecasts, fairly grim ones, that we get up to about double digits. So we hit 9, 10 by the end of the year.
Yep, it's possible.
It's quite possible given what we're talking about in terms of economic constraint driven by the Iran war. But also I can see, obviously in March there was a boost. We did have oil prices going up to where it came to sort of $2.30, $2.40 a gallon of unleaded in the country. Obviously the big cost of diesel is going to affect transport and getting things to market and to homes. But overall, Jack, I don't see too much of a spike in that March. Beyond that March month, if we go to April and May, and we're still not seeing the impacts of these things, we are seeing sort of slight hikes in food pricing, but not significant. I'm not seeing that sort of 10% sort of preconditions.
No,
we're certainly going to get a spike in, and any cost of living. I mean, it doesn't matter who's responsible for it. You could say it was Donald Trump or the mullahs or Benjamin Netanyahu. They're not going to face the loss of political capital. It's government in power that will always struggle with when cost of living issues become a problem.
And the best way to attack cost of living issues has always been, and I think always will be, to improve productivity. And because that's what
These
drives
things get
real
really
work.
complicated, Jack, because how do we go about it? It's not just as if you say, well, you work an 8-hour week, and if you work an 8-hour day, and we'd like you to work for 8.5, therefore your productivity has gone up by 8% or something like that. It doesn't quite work that way, because you've got a complicated economy, complex economy, that even things like housing. If you've got someone who lives next door to or lives in the same suburb as the factory, or just across the road from the factory, those are the people that you essentially want. Because if you've got people who have to travel by train or by car for an hour and a half there and an hour and a half back, they're not the ones who are going to be as productive because of the terrible sort of problems that they're facing, just in terms of getting to work. I was reading some development stuff around in the Herald today, Jack, about some of these new estates. This is in Sydney's northwest. The services in these places, in some of these places, so bad. They can't even get a set of traffic lights up, and people are just queuing at intersections all day long in order to make a right-hand turn. I guess what I'm saying is the catastrophic parts of inflation. While I can see some spikes, I just don't see the major sort of incremental up to 8 or 9% by the end of the year. But let's say that's the case. What do we have to deal with that? I mean, monetary policy is determined by the Reserve Bank. They were heavily criticised for not using monetary policy to reduce inflation post-pandemic, and should have done more during the pandemic when people had savings. So we're left with this kind of blunt instrument, Jack, to deal with inflation.
Yes.
That only really impacts anyone who's got a mortgage anyway. And that's, more often than not, it's going to be first home buyers who are going to feel that pinch.
But we had a complicated economy in 1983 as well, when Hawke was elected. Perhaps that's a little more complicated now, but not by much. And what that required was sitting down.
This is pre-internet, Jack. This is, now we're seeing. I don't want to pick you up, but there's a lot has changed. Australia was very much a heavily protected economy. We had a footwear and textile business in this country. I mean, we sort of still do, but everything's imported. I mean, look, I know what you mean. You're saying that you've got to have political courage to do these things.
Got to have someone who's prepared to make the Banana Republic speech, and we've got to have someone who's prepared to say this is the recession we needed to have.
Hawke hated
and mean it.
Hawke hated that.
Yeah, I know Hawke hated that second one, but sometimes those things need to be said, and we haven't got anybody who's prepared to say the things that need to be said.
Well, let's look at the political setup in the country as we are now. We've seen the rise of One Nation from a 5 or 6 point party to somewhere in the mid 20s, between 20 and 25. Labor has a massive seat majority in the lower house in the federal parliament, but their votes around 31, 32. It really hasn't changed very much from the last election. And the coalition, I mean, they wouldn't know if they were Arthur or Martha at the moment. And like I say, continue to make really bad decisions like preferencing One Nation in Farrah. Struck by fear and not quite sure what to do. And to be fair, there are no easy outs for them, are there?
Well, I don't think there are easy outs for either party. The Liberals' problems are just worse than the Labor problems, but they exist right across the board. And there are no real easy outs. And there's a kind of momentum to just keep drifting along the way they are drifting now, and be a little bit less worse than your opponent.
Well, what would you do, Jack? I mean, look, you talk about economic drifting. What should be the major economic reforms? You talked about productivity. How do we fix that? I mean, like I say, it's very, very complicated. It's not just a case of making everyone work half an hour longer on their shifts or however they go about their workplace, work an extra half an hour a day. It's not as simple as that, is it? Because people are working at sort of all-time highs when you look at the stats in terms of hours put in and so forth.
I mean, one of the basic things they did was to tie wage increases to productivity increases.
Yeah, and now we have a Fair Work Commission and we have an industrial relations set up that essentially, this is part of the problem, I think. A lot of big decisions have been handed on to agencies outside of government, external to government, yes. and a lot of the sort of policy fixing is almost graded in. So, or indexed, I suppose, is the best way of doing things. Like just a little thing, but in terms of establishing public service wage increases and things like that, these things are more or less indexed to cost of living and what have you. So, I mean, basically, what you'd like is to have tier one public transport systems in the country, and we're sort of getting there, but we've never been strong at this stuff. We've been a car driving nation for a long time. You got to get people, you got to be able to move large numbers of people quickly in order to get them to their workplaces and home. So I think we're sort of dealing with some of this stuff, but it just can't be as simple as, well, just work a little bit harder at work today.
No, well, a number of things. Free up housing development, and if that means annoying a few people in local government and state government, fine. And tie wage increases to productivity increases. Just do those two things to start with, and then go for it. But be prepared to wear the flag. I mean, this is going to be really unpopular, and you're going to have to look at public service numbers. I think Australia's numbers of public servants per people is just about the highest in the world now, and much, much higher than even the UK and European nations, et cetera, et cetera. So all this stuff's got to be looked at.
It depends how you look at that, Jack, because what you've seen, yes, there's been a large number of public servants hired by the federal government or during this government's tenure. But the consultancy bill is way, way down. And so what the Libs used to do is say, oh, well, we'll put a hiring ban on this department, that department. Meanwhile, here's a bloke from IBM, will sling in $40 million to create a census that doesn't work.
Yeah, well, I'm not saying this as an anti-Labor thing or as a pro-Liberal thing.
No, I'm not suggesting you are. I'm just saying
this is just where we are because we have just drifted for 20 years, right? And I'm saying if we want to be serious, if you want to look after that 18 to 44-year-olds, productivity growth, real wages growth, like we had for 30 years post 1983 election of Bob Hawke, is the way out of that.
All right, yeah. So when we have a look at, you were talking about planning approvals. Now, New South Wales government's pretty much imposed itself on councils, and when you talk about that NIMBY reaction, it's quite interesting. One of the inner west suburbs there. I know we've talked about this on the podcast previously. I'm just trying to think which one. But there was a Labor bloke, actually, retirement age sort of thing. He wanted the entire suburb to be National Trust listed, Jack. And there are these old, I mean, once you've seen a Federation bungalow, mate, you've seen them all, haven't you? I don't know why we would consider these things museum pieces.
I think you're talking about Haberfield.
Haberfield, thank you. Yeah, the bloke who lives on a quarter-acre block there and says, look, I like it just fine, and if you change it, I'm going to be really, really angry. And I understand it, right? Because people don't like change, particularly when it comes to, oh, God, look at there's a 10-story property next door. But at the same time, you've got to have some sort of reasonable expectation that the big cities need to change. They need to be more responsive to people. They need to be. I think Melbourne's actually done it better than Sydney, Jack. Historically,
and that's part of the reason why Melbourne's property prices are more reasonable than they are in elsewhere. I've got to tell you, heritage listing is a bit of a sore point with me right at the moment. So
I think I know what you're talking about there, mate. A mate of mine works. I won't say where, but he works at a government department. They work in one of these old buildings, one of these old beautiful sandstone buildings knocked up in the early part of the 19th century. And you can't put a PowerPoint in making an application to the National Trust. So there are particular problems there leading up to. They've got a room full of servers and computers and things like that, and it gets so bloody hot, it's just blowing the fuses out, and they sort of undercut because everything is so awfully slow about the National Trust listing. But yeah, it's part of the problem. It's part of the problem with Sydney. But when I say Melbourne has done this better, I think their local councils, particularly in the inner suburbs, have realised that there needed to be changes. So we have sort of more medium and high density housing available in these areas, whereas people in the inner west in particular have said, oh, we don't like that, and we'd like Haberfield to be a museum if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, I don't know whether you noticed this. Timmy Blair's mate, James Morrow, is that his name?
Yeah, James Morrow.
Yeah. I think he must own a house in the inner west, a cottage in the inner west, because
I think he lived in Leichhardt for a while. Yeah,
he's gung ho on not having any flats built in the area and all that kind of stuff. Which doesn't really fit in with the stuff he carries on with I'm told he carries on with on Sky News. But there you go.
Somewhat different. NIMBYism is a very powerful motivator, Jack.
It is. But I've had some friends who've been spending some time in Fitzroy lately, and you'd remember Fitzroy. Fitzroy used to have a lot of in amongst the cottages, a lot of light industrial buildings, warehouses, the old clothing factories.
Collingwood especially,
the old clothing factories, they're all willy-nilly being turned into, decent apartments and all that kind of stuff.
If you bought one of those, and a mate of mine did 10 years ago, you're sitting pretty, mate. And I think Melbourne got that much better. And if you do drive around the suburbs a bit, you'll see a lot of units placed on quarter-acre blocks. You'll see shared housing, whether it be two houses on the quarter-acre block and so forth. You go drive around the inner west of Sydney, you don't see anywhere near as much as that.
No.
And you're right. I mean, Melbourne's a bigger city than Sydney now in terms of population. But the median housing price is nowhere near. You could pick up an apartment in Hawthorn for about $700,000. You can't really buy anything in Sydney for under $1 million, and that takes you all the way out to Campbelltown and beyond, Jack. Those things need to change, and it is a productivity issue. So where are we, Jack? We've got raging inflation potentially with the Iran war. We've got a budget that needs to where spending needs to be restrained at a period where spending probably needs to be jacked up a little bit, certainly in some areas. So the politics is not really running the Albanese government's way. And I'd suggest to you they will play the demographic card pretty strongly when the budget's handed down.
Yeah, and we've got two money sinks that have to be fixed, the NDIS and Snowy Hydro.
Snowy Hydro, man.
Thank you, Malcolm.
I hesitate to say this, Jack, but it occurs to me that Malcolm Turnbull may have had the rose-coloured glasses on when he started talking about Snowy Hydro too. That is so far away from its immediate projections. We're talking about something like $20 billion blowout, Jack.
Yeah, or you could say that the developers of Snowy Hydro saw it coming and thought, "Well, this is a good,
Well, when you look, when you talk about renewables, hydro is one of those things that will produce vast amounts of power. If you've got an aluminium smelter, if you want to turn iron ore into steel, in Australia we still do a bit of that. Snowy Hydro is one of the best means to do that, but. Yeah,
if it was next door, and if it was next door.
Well, we were made to think that it was just there was a little piece and you could just plug it in and it'll all be fine. I did look at the original costings, but we should never get used to the fact that a budget has been created that's $20 billion out. we go, oh, that's why they put rubbers on pencils. It just doesn't make any sense. So if you're in government,
that's the Max Smart thing. Miss by just that much.
Yeah, that's right. So we should never sort of just shrug our shoulders. Well, they're only $10 billion out. Never be content with that. So if you're in sitting government in any Western democracy, you would be seeing yourself. Firstly, you've got probably in the developing world, you'll have a food crisis that will manifest itself in awful ways to those who can afford it least. In the West, we're going to have to pay more for staples and other things like construction, and we're going to have to pay more for that. If you're running a government in the West at the moment, you wouldn't think much of your chances, would you, being re-elected?
Very difficult at the moment. It depends whether, personally, I think the people who make the courageous decisions will be in government for the next 10 years. So that's the reward for taking the risk. The current German government, its only way to survive is to be courageous now. Otherwise, it will lose.
Yeah, we've seen this. I mean, we'll talk about Sir Keir Starmer's woes next week, but it would seem that there is a bit of number counting going on within the Labor with the U party in the UK. And what have we got? Only 3 days before the council elections and Welsh and Scottish elections.
Yeah. And this morning's story is that Wes Streeting, who I think is Minister for Health at the moment, says he's got the numbers and will start the process on Friday. The council elections are on Thursday. So
we'll take a look at that. We'll take a look at that next week. We might use that as the top the forum, because it is quite extraordinary the situation that Sir Keir Starmer finds himself in at the moment after an absolute triumph at the election, and really just he's rebounded, ricocheted from one scandal to another, and this last one might see him off. So we'll have a look at that.
Meanwhile, his erstwhile deputy, she was apparently a candidate until she decided to tie one on in the Strangers Bar at Westminster last week.
It's just lacking discipline, Jack, and basically conversations that she has no control over and all this sort of stuff.
Yeah, and crashed into a door on the way out. The door needed to be repaired, etc., etc. So it was a debacle, but an amusing one.
We're going to just sort of wrap up our conversation today. Given that, this is a rather dangerous time to be alive. I mean, you and I grew up in the shadows of a sort of threat of nuclear apocalypse driven by the Cold War. I've often thought about this, that the period just before and for the 10-year period thereafter of the collapse of the Soviet Union, that was basically the time to be alive. That was probably the pinnacle of Western civilization right there. And it's sort of going on a bit of a downward slope ever since. We talked about Trump. I'm not talking about Trump's presidency. As I said to you before, I think Trump is a symptom of a broken system, rather than being the one breaking the system. It's not just that, but do you get the feeling that we've come off the boil, Jack?
I didn't. I was born in 1955. I don't remember really ever thinking about nuclear Armageddon at all as a child or as a teenager. Or I know we used to do the protest, the movement against uranium mining, all that kind of stuff, right?
And I was part of it, Jack.
Yeah, I was. I used to go on the.
But the idea that we had enough nukes to blow the world up 6 times or something like that surely occurred to you. There was
Well,
there was a particularly
Of course, I knew that we did.
BBC docudrama released at the time, and I can't think what the title of it was, but it was really quite alarming. And I remember watching that as a 21-year-old, thinking, "Oh my God!" I mean, there was a fair amount of saber rattling going on. We had Reagan on a radio saying, "Well, the bombing starts now," and all this sort of stuff.
Yeah, I got to tell you, I used to go to these meetings, as you know, but I never walked out of there thinking, we're in trouble here. We're all going to be, wiped out in a nuclear war. Never once thought that.
Well, just on accidents alone, we came very, very close, and the Cuban Missile Crisis is probably as close as we've come. One of the great stories that I love is the one of Reagan meeting Gorbachev in Iceland, and Reagan actually hated nuclear weapons. So when he met Gorbachev, and with just a translator each, they had a conversation, and Gorbachev said, "Look, we're on our knees. We need to do something about nuclear armament and the arms race." And between he and Reagan, for the first 5 minutes, they both agreed to get rid of all of their nuclear weapons. And then the military from both sides came up. "Oh, no. Then we had salt limit restrictions and treaties based on that. But yeah, between the two leaders, they'd come up with neither of them having any nuclear arms left. But look, my point about all of that was to say, once the Berlin Wall came down, it really was this great triumph for Western civilization. And for the sort of 10-year period thereafter, it was, the wars breaking out all over the world, but this was a time of great peace, I reckon, around the world, and a time of great economic prosperity as well. And I don't know that we'll see that sort of prosperity again.
We are. There's never been a better time to be a human being than it is now. We've never been richer.
I reckon 20 years ago would have been a better time, and I guess that's what I'm talking about. That
20 years ago, there were another 500 million Chinese who were living in poverty that are now not living in poverty.
Yeah, well, that's all true too. I mean, I suppose I'm fixated on Western democracies, but that, when we talk about that period when the Howard government was in power, it was just money to burn. I mean, basically they had to get to a budget every year and think, what are we going to do with all this surplus? And then threw it around the middle classes, and in some cases, built investment programs. Look, I guess the other thing, Jack, is when we talk about, let's say, the Scandinavians, in particular the Danes, the Norwegians, and the Finns, why are they so happy on these sort of indices around prosperity and happiness and satisfaction and so forth? Why are they so happy and we're not?
Living a miserable existence up there where it's cold as all get out. Yeah, I can't see it either.
Well,
and they're just generally miserable.
Let's ignore the weather for a minute.
But they're generally miserable people as well.
They're not. They're not chatters. They tend to be. They only speak when they feel a need to do so. But what their governments did there, Jack, with the North Sea around the Norwegians at least, is they set up basically a public funding program that meant that everyone could retire with some money, without being poor. The Norwegians have virtually defeated homelessness. They've been able to create economic prosperity, but spread that around, and I guess in that sort of small L socialist way that the Scandinavians are sort of famous for. And then when we look at the indices, how are you happy? Are you satisfied? They're miles ahead of everyone. So what are they doing right that we're not?
I don't think things are quite so sunny in Denmark, Sweden and Finland. No, they certainly are not. but Norway's made excellent use of the North Sea oil.
Yeah. So why can't we do the same thing? I guess that's what I was getting at, Jack. Why can't we do the same thing? And can I offer a potential answer is that the mining industry won't allow us to do it, Jack? To put some of those ads on, you know?
Yeah, well,
they're doing it again, actually. You're seeing them on the TV at the moment. So the mining council's up and about.
That was a very effective lobby campaign.
I'm not sure that this one is quite as effective, but the history of Australia economically, Jack, is one that says, look, we've got these sort of tepid royalties in place through the states. There's nothing overseeing it. There's the petroleum rent resource tax, and those things are hardly ever levied. And basically, you've got mining companies loading up their ships and sending them off overseas with the Australian people receiving very little of it.
Yes.
Is it just because we're so terrified of the mine, or politicians are so terrified of the mining industry, that we can't do these things, these great big nation-building things?
A bit of that.
No, it is, isn't it? Anyway, Gina's all over the one nation. So, that's their little spike there, and mostly blue-collar people, the one nation people. They're actually going to be going out and voting for smaller wages, which is kind of amusing to me. All righty, well, that was a good chat, and I think we're getting our listeners get something out of it.
Just before we go, tip for the Farrah by-election, what do you think?
I think it's probably One Nation's to lose, just with the preference set up as it is.
I think it probably is too.
All right. Well, we'll move on to sport, Jack, and let's kick it off with Premier League. And there was a good little analysis piece there saying that Arsenal would get the job done. They had a 3-1 win over the weekend. Also, I think their stalkers, Man City, had a good win as well. Tottenham, Jack, had a win over Aston Villa and have just pushed out of the danger zone. Well, they're still in the danger zone, but they're not in the bottom three, which means West Ham are in the gun. And when we look at who's going to play each other, look, there's only 1 point between Man City and Arsenal at the moment. I think when I look at the table, I think they've only got 3 to come. Arsenal and Man City have got 5.
Yeah.
And there are a couple of little problematic games there for Man City. So I'll get your tip on who wins it.
Oh, I think City will win.
Yeah, I think Arsenal have done enough, and I think they'll be all right. There's a game that Man City play away. Aston Villa is their last game, and I think could be a bit of a problem game for them. We'll see. Certainly, it would be very, very sad for Arsenal to miss out again, but we shall see. And Tottenham not out of danger, but West Ham, gee whiz, how the mighty have fallen. It's either them or Spurs to go. Yeah. So, and moving on to, we'll stick with rugby league. Check what is going on with the Melbourne Storm. They're second bottom, and they got belted again after starting pretty well. Had another loss on the weekend. I think it's 7 in a row now, Jack.
It doesn't look a happy team, does it?
Well, they're trying to. I don't know whether this is the problem, but they're trying to score their way out of trouble, and that means they can lose the plot defensively. But it's going to impact on state of origin selection too, because Melbourne Storm, pretty much half the team are in either the Queensland or New South Wales squads, and generally more Queensland than others. But some of these guys, you couldn't play them at the moment. They're just not playing well enough.
I haven't seen all that much of it, but the thing that always struck me about Storm was that they always looked so well coached and well organised, and they really don't at the moment.
No, there's a sort of sense of desperation around them. Roosters are going beautifully at the moment. They're sitting third, and of course the Panthers on top, Warriors second. Rabbitohs fourth, and Tigers going okay. Had a loss on the weekend, but going okay in the 8. If you had said that last year, that they'd be in the 8 this year, you probably would have got laughed at. Besides this Melbourne Storm, I guess the other sort of shameful thing is Dragons with only the one win at this stage, and a very proud club, really struggling.
You had a bit to do with them years ago, didn't you? Didn't you work for them for a little bit?
Yeah, well, I
did some work with them.
I was doing their website for them, and
it's
had some lovely people there, but their bosses, all I can tell you is, I just thought they were really ordinary. I thought they were very average. So I found the same about Parramatta, to be honest. I used to do work for them as well. And that was perhaps for different reasons. I mean, I think St. George had this sense of, we are sort of this major club in the NRL and we are sort of inviolable.
Well, they were a major club. Yeah,
they won 11 flags in a row, mate.
Yeah, but they haven't been a major club for a long time.
No, but this year it looks like, they've sacked a coach and it hasn't changed anything, and their playing list is terrible, and it's it really is one of those things driven by management. Over to the AFL, Jack, I guess the big story of the week is Carlton's another astonishing lapse. You can almost set your clock to it now. Up in front at half time. They've been in front in 6 of the 8 games, and only won one of them. And St Kilda just ripped them apart. And to be fair to St Kilda, I think perhaps people aren't focusing on it. They showed a real ability to score quickly, and they've got plenty of weapons to do that.
Yeah, St Kilda are pretty good. I watched the first half with a mate and left at half time, and he said, "Carlton, this time?" I said, "Well, nowhere near, not far enough in front, nowhere near it."
They were playing a style of football in that second quarter, Jack, Carlton, where they just were disposing by foot at around about 100%, near enough to anyway, just hitting targets and just looked fine. Still struggled in terms of that connection up forward. But the first thing I'd say about Carlton is that the quality of their list alone, if you were just going to work off list quality, they'd be in the bottom 4, which is where they are. They lost a gun forward, power forward in Charlie Curnow. They lost a ruckman who hasn't set the world on fire at St Kilda, although he had a pretty good game on the weekend. And they lost, a good swing man in Jack Silvani. I mean, all of them, I noticed they were booing people, booing De Koning and Silvani at the game. I mean, Jack Silvani has earned the right to play wherever he bloody well likes, and Tom De Koning, well, if someone drives up to your door and offers you $2 million a year, you're probably going to say, okay, I reluctantly accept. So I got no problem about any of that. But it does mean that they were they were always going to be vulnerable anyway. So I think that's part of the problem. And then, I don't know, I've looked at some of the analysis from people like Matthew Lloyd and what have you, and yes, there's a lack of defensive run. Yes, it seems to be a discipline thing or maybe a fitness thing, which you would find hard to believe in this day and age. But how do you get yourself out of it, Jack? How does Carlton get themselves out of this terrible thing, or are they just going to traumatise an entire list and then start again?
Well, that's the real danger now, is that even their good players are not playing well. So Jacob Wettering, who's a terrific player, he was in the media gun after this weekend, and he just doesn't look like he's. I'm not saying he doesn't look like he's trying. He does look like he's trying.
I got the feeling he might be carrying something. I know.
Yeah.
His wife has just had a little baby. That can affect the player too. Mm-hmm. But he looks like he's carrying something at the moment,
And to me,
but if you're looking at your fullback as the problem, then
no, well, it's not. He's not the problem. I was talking about him as a symptom rather than the cause of the problem. I mean, part of the thing I've thought all along, and from last year as well, is that they've got a game plan that they can't keep playing for the whole game.
That's the problem.
So there's a problem there. I think they're trying to play a game plan that they haven't got the cattle to play. Right?
I don't think anybody's got the cattle. I just think that game has sort of moved on from this concentration on contest, and so the Blues' vulnerability is that they will lose contest for a period of time, and then there's no defensive run. You've got blokes who are just stalwarts of the club, and I won't criticise them. But Patrick Cripps, if someone like Wanganeen Miller runs, gets a step on him, he's gone. Pat just can't keep up with him speed wise. He is a in and under grunt player. And then they've got Adam Chera, who's pretty much the same. Then you've got George Stewart as the winner of the BNF last year, who can't get a game, but a similar sort of player.
Because he's the same.
Similar player. Yeah. I mean, I was saying to a mate, I said, I don't see how they can play Chera and George. And again, they go through these little periods there, and I know David King pulled this out where, their midfielders are just coughing up possession too easily with poor disposal. And that certainly happened. I think Walsh and certainly Chera were just coughing the ball up when they had it. But the biggest problem they have is this contest, this focus on contest can't be sustained for a period of time. And when a side comes at them, and now knowing, that it's in the back of everyone's mind at Carlton and throughout the whole comp, that they're going to really come hard at them in the third and last quarter. The way it's played today, you have to understand that at some stage the other mob are going to get their hands on a lot of footy, and they're going to really hurt you, and you've got to kind of hang in there and minimise that, and their game plan doesn't do that. No, that's right. And that's not to say people like Jacob Wiedering or somebody. I mean, Harry Dean, I think he's been a revelation. Yeah. I love seeing him play. He's a perfect defender. And he's just a kid, right? He's 19. There's an enormous amount of upside. But it's not the defence that are the problem. It's the whether you call them, whether you want to say they're downhill skiing, they're getting ready to have possession and they just can't defensively get back.
Yeah,
a lot of footy is won by centre stoppages or centre clearance, but so when you see Wanganeen Miller running out of the centre towards goal, you know something's going to happen. There's going to be a score. There's going to be a score, either a goal or a point kick within a few seconds. Yeah, so it's not just that, but it's that defensive run. See, there was a highlight of a St Kilda kick out where there were four blokes all standing around the pockets, and two St Kilda guys just standing on their own 40, 50 metres out of goal. And it was like, what's going on there, guys? Why aren't you telling each other to get up and man these guys up? And they just went coast to coast a few times. A lot of scragging free kicks too from these central from centre stoppages. So there was a frustration that got in there too. But I think there's a view now that Michael Voss certainly won't be coaching next year, and they'll just sort of let this run. But I don't know how much the players can go through this without them being severely impacted or affected by it.
That's why I don't think he'll make. He might get to the mid-year bye, but I doubt that he will get that far, because it's getting to the point now where you are. This is damaging players for the future. Yeah. You are losing players, losing interest, and you're actually not developing your young players because you're teaching them to play a bad way.
Yeah, I mean, he was beaten on the Saturday night. Matthew Carroll's been a revelation. He's only just a young bloke on the wing, doing really well. Didn't have a great game on Saturday night, but he's been one who's sort of flourished. But then there are other players that are new to the club, including the two who've come from Sydney. Ollie Florence, a very experienced guy. So's the forward. But they're struggling now too and they would never have been part of anything like this before.
No.
That, it must be mentally draining after a while, and something's got to give. And I think that's probably it, that the coach has to go, and you have an interim coach, someone like Josh Fraser, former Collingwood ruckman. And of course they do have the former Eagles coach, Jack.
He's on part-time staff there, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of where they'll go. But
he's good, I think, Adam Simpson.
I think so. I mean, I'm not inside the club, so I don't know whether Michael Voss is a good coach or a bad coach or just a good coach out of luck. I don't know, and it's really sad. And of course, Carlton's got a long history of knifing coaches, and it doesn't always come with good results. You sort of go to sort of maybe, it's really, really sad, I think, for someone just like you look at Patrick Cripps and say, you're never going to play in a grand final.
You be pretty confident that's true, right at the moment.
And after everything he's done at that club, I mean, it just seems awful.
And what's even sadder is that they looked the winner at a preliminary final just a few years ago. And they've gone backwards since then.
And 4 goals up at quarter time against Brisbane, who went on to win the flag. I mean, that was the time to put the foot on the gas and then say, well, we've just done enough. That was the time to really go hard. But I mean,
tell you who were good at the weekend. Melbourne are actually. I mean, they've gotten rid of a lot of good players.
Different playing style, and much better.
You're talking about Carlton letting some good players go. Melbourne let some real good ones go, and they are much better.
Yeah, and really, if you're looking at sort of Carlton's problems, Melbourne was similar. They were a contest-based team, contest-based midfield. They've got blokes like Cuzzy Pickett running in the midfield now, just almost unstoppable. Swans were very good.
What did Dean Cox say after the game? He said he thought our bloke on I can't remember who played on Cozzy did a great job. He said only had 14 touches till 3/4 time, but this kid, he's going to get the footy at some stage and he's going to hurt you. I mean,
just the idea. I mean, I know he's played in the midfield prior to this season, but not as often. No. And it's just a revelation, and that's where footy is now. You want to see these blokes running through the centre square at goal from centre stoppage. So they are the great improver so far. I think North have done pretty well. They probably don't get the rub of the green from the umpires. I'm sure there'll be a few North supporters who agree with me there. But they're doing enough. And the Tigers had a good win, and it's an extraordinary win given the fact that I mean, if you and I turned up a punt road, we'd pretty much get a game. We'd certainly get a game in the VFL at the moment. They've got that many injuries. And they got to about, I think, 10 points in front, and then the Eagles kicked a goal, and I thought, oh, here we go. They're probably going to get steamrolled. And jumped up, kicked a couple of goals. So I think they're well coached, and I think they're well led, and they're in a development phase. But good on them for having a win. And I think the other mob that I thought might sort of drop off a little bit, but Collingwood is still going well, still really well coached, I think.
Yeah.
All right.
They're doing better than they're doing much better than their list would indicate, and they have for a while.
Yeah, and then of course have you seen the jumper that the games holder Scott Pendlebury will wear, Jack? Have you seen that?
No, I haven't seen that.
It's just got the gold numbers on the back, Jack. And as I understand, he's the only one who'll wear that.
Oh dear.
Not sure about that. They did seek AFL approval, and maybe they're all wearing the gold numbers on the back. I don't know, but I think it's
I'm not a fan of that. No.
But it is an extraordinary achievement. I think it's 2-3 weeks away, but it's just an extraordinary achievement what he's been able to do with his footy career and play pretty much at the top throughout, you know.
Well, look at the difference between North and Collingwood in that regard. I think Brent Harvey would still be playing, and he got
still is.
I think he's still playing suburban footy, isn't he?
He was playing for North Heidelberg for a while. His brother, that's where his brother plays, and not long after he retired, he bobbed up and kicked 12. Travis Cloak, Jack, had an interesting weekend. He was coaching a group of kids, then went and played, I can't remember, some in a suburban comp. Just arrived, 2:00, run out the ground, 2:10, got into the kick and just managed to kick a lazy 18. So he had a bit of a day out, according to what I read in the papers. All right.
Okay.
That takes us out. We're not quite sure what we're going to be dealing with next week, but I think, what do you reckon, Jack, that we have a look at Sir Keir Starmer and how this all came about? And, of course, well, we must have a look at Mandelson, because for the life of me, I cannot understand how that particular turd floated to the top and continued to do so. So we might look at that as a sort of a model for how bad governments and unprepared governments can be if they're not properly led. Have you got anything else for us, Jack, today?
No, nothing else.
All right. Okay. Well, thanks for that, listeners. And don't forget to drop us a line. Ray, yes, you're in there, and we'll get you in there next week, I promise. But also, we do want to talk about Sir Keir Starmer next week. So if you want to offer anything about the UK political setup, please drop us a line. Whether you think reform is making a comeback, and whether you think Farage, I should say, is going to make a comeback, or whether he's plateaued. Just where is it all going to be in just a year's time? Because let's not forget, the government is in power for the next 3.5, Jack, isn't it? Well, 3, still 3.
Yeah,
3 and a
still
bit.
3, I think. Yeah.
So, look, just drop us a line. You know how to get hold of us. All right, folks, that takes us out for this day, the 4th of May 2026, and we look forward to speaking to you next week. See ya.